Hello, and welcome to tonight's City Club of Boise evening conversation on understanding the invasion of Ukraine, early impressions. I'm Dr. Catherine Himes, City Club of Boise board member and tonight's moderator. This program is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel, and the audio will be provided to our media partner, Boise State Public Radio. City Club of Boise brings people together to explore community issues and hear diverse viewpoints by creating spaces where conversations happen. This is possible through the support of our members and sponsors, and for this, we say thank you. This particular program is a partnership with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Boise State University. Welcome, Osher members. Our premier sponsor is Northwest Nazarene University and the NNU College of Business. Our annual sponsor is the University of Idaho. We also receive support from our forum series sponsors, AARP Idaho, Bank of Idaho, Echelon Group, Micron, Optum Idaho, Pacific Source Health Plans, and Small Mine Development. City Club of Boise receives grant funding from the Idaho Humanities Council. Thanks also to our media partners, which include Boise State Public Radio, Idaho Statesman, and Idaho Public Television, and our university partners, Boise State University and Northwest Nazarene University. We would like to acknowledge the ancestral, cultural, traditional, and unceded territory of the Shoshone, Bannock, and Northern Paiute people on which we are meeting today. The goal of this conversation is to gain perspective and understanding of the invasion of Ukraine. Our speakers tonight will offer early impressions about the conflict and devote time to responding to your questions. You can use the Q&A function of Zoom or email your question to morgan@cityclubofboise.org, and it will be provided to me. I'll do my best to present each question, but may group similar inquiries together in the interest of time. In addition to tonight's panel, we have received a video recording of remarks from U.S. Senator Jim Risch, ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We'll start the program with Senator Risch's video, then hear from each panelist before moving to your question. Here's the video.
Hi, I'm Senator Jim Risch. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. I wish it was possible for me to be with you in person, but the Senate's in session this week, so this substitute is going to have to do. I serve as the top Republican on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and also as a senior member of the Senate Intelligence Committee and also the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Recently, these three portfolios have become even more critical as the Russian invasion of Ukraine grows more dangerous each day and high energy costs continue to break records. In short, these are pretty busy days. Unfortunately, everyone saw this invasion coming. A year ago, Putin began amassing troops on Ukraine's border. Last fall, open source intelligence showed Russia building infrastructure and putting even more troops along the border of Ukraine. During this time, I was vocal about imposing preemptive sanctions to deter Putin from this invasion. Unfortunately, because of the dithering, the job didn't get done and he invaded. The administration finally did the right thing and put in place a number of sanctions along with our European partners. But these sanctions have not worked yet. They are not stopping Putin's military from its ongoing deadly assault, which is spreading across Ukraine and over the weekend came close to Poland and NATO's borders. Ukrainians are going through exactly what we went through trying to get our freedom in 1776. It is time we drop the hammer and completely shut down the economy in Russia, which we have the ability to do. Some of my colleagues and I spoke with President Zelensky, and he had one request that is not hard for us to help with: more weapons and lethal aid. He needs more, and he needs it faster. The United States and our NATO allies can and should be doing more to arm the Ukrainians and equip them with airplanes and additional air defenses. By air defenses, I mean surface-to-air missiles. If Ukraine can defend their own skies and continue to fend off Russian attackers, the whole world wins. I have offered a number of proposals that would cripple the Russian economy and give the Ukrainians badly needed support in this fight, and it's all laid out in my bill, the NET Act. We must sanction all of Russia's banks, appropriate industries, including its energy industry, and including secondary sanctions which will isolate the Russian financial system. With the Nord Stream 2 oil pipeline shut down, we now must help end Europe's dependence on Russian oil and gas. The president should immediately resume the domestic energy projects he canceled, like construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. That pipeline alone would have made up for more than the Russian oil that we were importing before the Ukraine war began. Sadly, the human toll that has resulted from Putin's unprovoked attack on Ukraine is incredible and growing each day. The United States and our allies must do more to help the Ukrainian people, innocent women and children, and men on the front lines who have no desire to be in this war. We can do this without military involvement. Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980 into a very dangerous world, caused primarily by the Soviet Union. And in 8 years, he brought the Soviet Union crumbling and without ever firing a shot. We can do the same by using economic tools to bring the Russian economy to its knees and arming Ukraine to defend itself. And this can be done with no U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine. This conflict has immense implications for the people of Ukraine and indeed for the world. It also speaks to the credibility of the United States and the West to defend the freedom and sovereignty of countries that want to decide their own futures. China is watching carefully, and it's being reported that Putin is now trying to bring the Chinese into the war in a more meaningful way. Meanwhile, I pray for the Ukraine and its people every day, and I hope you will join me in doing that. They need our prayers, our support, and our leadership during this difficult time. No one leads like America does when America leads. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you. I just wish it was in person with the opportunity to take questions. Thank you.
I want to thank Senator Risch, who is one of our Idaho federal delegation members, our sitting U.S. Senator who's on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, for providing these remarks. Now, I'm really thrilled to turn to our speakers. I'm going to introduce each speaker who presents a different perspective on Ukraine, meaning we have cultural and historical experts, we have people who are really focused on what's happening on the ground, and then somebody who's really looking at what's happening in the region, what's happening internationally, and is more of a Russia expert. So I'm going to introduce each of our panelists, and then they will speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll turn to the next panelist. And after we move through the whole panel, then we'll turn to audience questions. So first, it's my pleasure to introduce Connie Collins. Connie served as a Peace Corps volunteer from 2003 to 2005. She was an environmental consultant for a non-governmental organization in I'm not going to get this correct. Korostishi, Ukraine, which began her love and her study of Ukrainian history, culture, traditions, and people. Ms. Collins lectures on topics of Ukraine, including the geopolitics of Ukraine, and has worked as a professional counselor, educator, and consultant in many states and overseas. Connie was serving during the Orange Revolution in 2004. She has returned to Ukraine every 2 years for extended stays and travel in the country. Connie, welcome.
Thank you. Many in the world were really shocked at the resistance of the Ukrainians, their bravery, and they wondered where they got that. I believe that it is due to their culture, and it's not scientific, but I also think it's in their genes. Kiev, or the state of Ukraine, city-state of Ukraine, was founded in 482 on the banks of the Dnipro River. That's approximately 500 years before Moscow. By the year 1000, it was the largest city in Europe with a population of 50,000. Kiev University was already established, as was St. Michael's Monastery that you see the gold domes. And it was well renowned as a trade center and agricultural center of the world. It prospered after the Mongol invasion, which of course destroyed the government, cities, etc. Ukraine reestablished itself, but the empire building of especially the Polish-Lithuanian Empire in the beginning, there were the Cossacks in southern Ukraine rose up and led the battle for several hundred years against the Polish. Finally, they signed an agreement with the czars of Russia that Russia would keep the Poles out and Ukraine would submit to certain taxes, etc. Well, immediately the czars reneged on their promise and subjugated Ukraine, let them keep their independence somewhat, but tried to suppress their language, their traditions, and their customs. This battle went on until the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And for 2 years, Ukraine was an independent nation. They had devised a constitution in 1710, which actually had 3 branches of legislature, government. Then Lenin decided that that was too much independence because he believed that persons were subjected to the state. And so they immediately quashed the independence movement of Ukraine. When Stalin took over, he imposed in 1929 the program of collectivization. Ukraine was a country of small farms, and as many of you probably know, the breadbasket of Europe still is in many ways. And Stalin needed the wheat that those farms produced, but they weren't producing it as fast as he wanted. So he started imposing collectivization, suppressed the language, the decolonization, in other words, the small farms, he was disposing of those. His methods included the Holodomor, the Great Starvation, during which 5 million Ukrainians and Cossacks were starved to death deliberately. By the end of 1939, the process ended in 14.5 million deaths of Ukrainians and Cossacks. 2 years later, Hitler invaded Ukraine on his way to Operation Barbarossa to conquer Moscow, Stalingrad, and St. Petersburg. The goal of Barbarossa, was to execute 65% of the Ukrainians and to put the rest as slaves into the Wehrmacht. During that campaign from 41 to 43, Ukrainians resisted mightily, and at the end, 3 million Ukrainians, which included 1 million Jews, died in those 2 years. That was more than the American, British, and French forces combined. So just from that alone, you can see how much they have resisted. After that, you know that they got their independence when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. Their first real election where they were electing their own candidates for president instead of the Kremlin appointed, or I should say the Russian appointed president, was in 2004. In 2004, a man by the name of Yanukovych, which you may remember, and Yushchenko, who favored the West, were running. Yushchenko was poisoned with dioxin during the campaign, and it's been proven by the the Security Bureau by the Russians. He did survive, came back horribly disfigured and crippled. The election was held. Yanukovych won in spite of every poll and all the, things that went on. Ukrainians went to the street, and this is the thing that I think we're seeing now. For 3 months during the coldest 3 months of the year, December, January, and February, 30,000 people stood in Maidan and then rose up in all the other cities. They never left. They protested peacefully for 3 months until finally the judiciary declared that there would be a re-election and Yushchenko won. 10 years later, in 2014, Yanukovych again was the president. He had won the presidency, and he was in his last year. He had promised Ukraine that they would join the European Union. The last month before the election, he reneged on that promise and said no, he would go with Putin and the CES. Again, Ukrainians took to the streets. But this time, Yanukovych did not allow them to protest peacefully. Again, for the 3 coldest months of the year, they stood in Maidan. But this time, Yanukovych sent in a special group called the Berkut, and the Berkut beat everybody that they could catch constantly. So barricades were thrown up. I won't go into all the details, but there was much, much violence. Ukrainians stayed there for 3 months. Supported each other. And finally, in the last week, it was in February, I'm trying to remember the exact date. Anyway, the Berkut were assigned as snipers, and they set up on a hill outside of Maidan and started firing into the crowd. At the end of that time, there were at least 100 dead and hundreds wounded. That night, Yanukovych, knowing that, that he wasn't going to win, flew out of Ukraine to Russia with $70 billion of Ukraine's money. So this has been, I think, a history of any time that a government or a dictator comes in and tries to impose, first of all, suppression of the language. Their language was always forbidden, but they have preserved it. Suppression of their customs, their whatever, their rule, their sense of independence, how they want to run their government. They're going to fight back. And quite frankly, I'm of the opinion that they will not give up. He may destroy the cities, but I don't think they'll ever give up. Thank you.
Connie, thank you so much for speaking about the history of Ukraine and the people and this arc and the commonalities over time. I'm sure we're going to have questions for you from our audience. Marla, I'm going to introduce you next. It's my pleasure to welcome Marla Keenan. Marla is an adjunct senior fellow at the Stimson Center. Her areas of expertise are international security policy, human rights in armed conflict, protection of civilians, civilian harm tracking and analysis, and urban warfare. Marla has conducted high-level advocacy with international and regional organizations, including the UN, African Union, and NATO, and has worked on conflict in crisis in many countries, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, Ethiopia, Lebanon, Mali, Israel, Jordan, Nepal, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ukraine, Yemen, and the Central African Republic. Marla, welcome.
Thanks so much. Makes me feel old to hear that many conflicts, and also extremely sad. So thank you so much for having me first. I'm really happy to be here with you all tonight, and I hope I can spend the next few minutes just sort of contextualizing what I think all of us have been obsessively watching on our television over the last 3 weeks. So I worked on and traveled to Ukraine from 2015 through 2018 when I was the Senior Director of Programs at Center for Civilians in Conflict. We started a Ukraine project there in 2015 with a research project, and then it's grown since there. It's been almost 3 weeks, and to me, it feels like a decade. And I hope for many of you, you're getting more sleep than some of us who are trying to watch this 24 hours a day are. I don't want to repeat what you're hearing on the news. I want to kind of give you my own viewpoint of what I think is happening and put into context some of the things that you're hearing from some of the military analysts and humanitarian analysts on television. So I think we've heard a lot of people note that Russia has consistently underperformed, but they're still wreaking havoc on the civilian population. And, I agree 100% with Connie. Ukrainians are incredibly resilient, and they have shown themselves to be not only brave, but just also lighthearted with a sense of humor that's really, really hard to find in a conflict. And I think that's endeared them to so many of us here. And it makes them feel like a known people to us and someone who we can really grab onto and sort of understand their strife. Being resilient is one of the things that allows civilians to survive in conflict. And so I think that's really going to help them. But unfortunately, urban war is extremely hard for militaries, and it is deadly for civilians. I think, from what we know about Russian military doctrine and past experience, what we've seen the Russians do in Syria, for example, in Chechnya, we know that they are a brutal force. We know that they target civilian populations. We know that they target civilian infrastructure, and we know that they do this knowing what is going to happen and really knowing that this is illegal under international humanitarian law, but nonetheless doing it. So this war is unlikely to be short, in my opinion, and there is likely not to be a decisive outcome of this. I think what we may see is just low-level conflict for a long, long time, some occupation, and then a really active and deadly counterinsurgency against the Russians. I think if that goes on for a while, that's going to be deadly for both sides. Even as Russia overtakes many of these areas, you're just going to continue to see fighting and pushing back and forth of front lines. And it's not going to look like what we're used to seeing in the previous wars of the last 2 decades that the United States has participated in. So trying to contextualize it like we've contextualized Afghanistan or even Libya or Iraq is just not going to work, and it's going to cloud the analysis of the conflict. This is a full-scale international armed conflict. So under international law, there are different types of armed conflict. There's international armed conflict. There's non-international armed conflict. There are groups of laws that govern each one. Most Americans are used to seeing COIN and CT operations for the last 20 years, but this is and will continue to be very different. We have already seen, I've spoken to a few people who are like, oh my gosh, look at how many civilians have already died, or look at how many military have already died. In an international armed conflict, the casualties are much higher than what we have seen in the last 20 years. So unfortunately, I think we're just going to have to expect more of that. And I'm going to get here into a minute on what we can all be thinking about and doing and pushing our governments to do to try and decrease civilian harm. So one thing I want to note is that this is both a conflict, but also a complex crisis, right? So anytime we have a conflict, we have the military side of what's going on in the country happening, where security forces are fighting each other, the government is fending off the security forces, but we also have what's happening for the civilian population, which is the humanitarian crisis, right? So we're seeing this in towns and cities across Ukraine. We are seeing civilians suffer not just from bullets and bombs, but also from lack of access to basic needs, such as food, water, shelter, and electricity. So those are some things that we should be keeping at the front of our mind as we're thinking about what we want governments to do in order to help. So I've been struck by the calls for assistance from Western governments, which have tended to only focus or primarily focus on kinetic assistance and materials such as weapon systems. This is incredibly short-sighted. Yes, they are fighting a war. Yes, they're trying to win. Yes, they need weapons to do this. But if we're only focusing on the military side, we're missing the larger 360-degree view of what is a complex crisis. the Ukrainian government and NATO need to be focused on the next challenges. Obviously, the Ukrainian government has their hands full. NATO can support the Ukrainian government looking at these future challenges. So it is winter over there. It is very cold. The Russians have already hit TV towers. They've already targeted critical infrastructure such as the electrical grid, water systems, sewers, etc. And while the Russian military has been slow to progress the front lines forward, they're cutting off civilians from all the things that they need just to survive. So imagine that you're not only fleeing bullets and bombs, you're also trying to just find clean water and food for your family. This is a situation that is a recipe for disaster, and NATO should really be focusing, NATO and the US and all of the allies should really be focusing on how they can support Ukraine as they're pre-positioning logistical capabilities and support, food, water, shelters that can be moved and set up in different places, setting up receiving locations across borders in countries, Western countries, where refugees can be received, where people can receive medical assistance. Even dead body management and mobile morgues are important, because you see in some of these towns that dead bodies and the mortuaries are already full and cannot handle the capacity. So all these things are incredibly important to human dignity and to making sure that we're supporting Ukrainians as they exhibit their resilience. Quick question, quick couple of things about NATO. So NATO, as you know, is an ally and partner organization. So there are 30 allies, and they function as a consensus organization, meaning the allies have to come to an agreement together in order for anything to be done. So we've seen a lot of discussion about, quote unquote, triggering Article 5 or putting a no-fly zone up. Triggering Article 5 is not a thing that can even happen in this conflict, because Ukraine is not an ally, it's a partner. And while it's an important partner, the way that the documents are written just does not even allow for that. So I just kind of want to put that out front, because I hear a lot of people calling me or writing to me on Twitter saying, like, we need Article 5, and it's just not a thing that can happen. With the no-fly zone, for those of us who watch these things, both on the humanitarian and on the military side, a no-fly zone is inherently an offensive operation. So you have to have rules of engagement that allow you to shoot down another aircraft. And as soon as you have that in place, you're in some really perilous territory in terms of it not being assistance missions anymore and it being an offensive operation. So I just want to put those kind of two things out there, because I know people are very interested, and I'm happy to answer any questions about those. I would just add on the no-fly zone that also most of the civilians are being harmed with artillery and land-launched weapons, not from the air. So a no-fly zone doesn't do a ton to protect civilians from artillery and mortars. So what I think is really needed is smart and forward thinking and planning on humanitarian concerns. Obviously, weapons are going to be provided and weapons should be provided, but we really need to be supporting the country to pre-position aid for them and have everything right there that they can access, because that's what's going to save civilian lives in the end.
Marla, thank you very much for sharing your expertise on conflicts, humanitarian crisis, and beginning to help us understand the complexity of this. We're going to turn next to Chase. I am pleased to introduce Chase Johnson to this group. Chase is a board member at the Frank Church Institute at Boise State University and a PhD candidate at Warwick University. He has degrees in international relations from Boise State and Johns Hopkins Universities. Previously, he served with the U.S. Peace Corps as an education and youth development volunteer in the Republic of Georgia. He has also worked on economic affairs for the U.S. State Department and on NATO policy for the U.S. Department of Defense. Chase teaches classes on global studies and Russian politics. Chase, thank you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. It's a huge fan of City Club. It's really great to be here speaking to you. So two really difficult acts to follow. Thank you so much, Connie and Marla. But hopefully I can provide a little perspective on what's going on outside of the borders of Ukraine right now. got into Russian studies because I love the history, the literature, the food, the people. I wanted to travel there. But alas, here we all are studying a full-blown land war in Europe. Like Marla said, I hope we're all practicing self-care right now, because it's really hard to see what's going on, especially in a place and to people that I really love and care about so much. So the top line of what I want to say tonight, and what I want, my perspective to be the main takeaway, is right now, internationally and diplomatically, we're doing what we should have done 8 years ago when Ukraine was invaded, when its sovereignty violated, its people killed, and its borders redrawn. So I'll just kind of leave that for our audience to chew on. So our sanctions response, I was in the Russian embassy, the U.S. embassy in Moscow in 2014, and was sent there to write on Russian industry, but was co-opted into sanctions writing. Again, a lot of this, my expertise on conflict has been against my own will. But, so our sanctions seem to be targeted at two main pillars of Russian political power. And it gives us a good opportunity to kind of pull back the curtain, or as we understand it in the West, I'll remind you it's not perfect, of the power that underpins Vladimir Putin. Oligarchs and rich people who scooped up previously public utilities, businesses, and resources after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and got fantastically rich off of this, and also the Siloviki. The Siloviki, or the strongmen in English, is not a very common talking point in Western media, but these are the high-ranking members of the security services, the Army, the National Guard, the intelligence, and whatnot. So our sanctions seem to be going after the oligarchs' wealth, their toys, their investments. You see reports of yachts being captured across Europe. And our defense aid seems to be targeting the Siloviki in a way that we can humiliate them on the battlefield. And so I think, while it's not perfect, it seems to be a more effective response to the last time war broke out in Ukraine internationally. So let's talk about both just very briefly, and then we'll turn it over to questions. I see a lot of armchair quarterback operations and op-ed writers from the New York Times and the Washington Post, and in my opinion, they always get sanctions wrong. Sanctions are not about changing behavior with Putin. They're about imposing costs upon Putin's actions in the hope that those costs will course correct. So that is a very subtle distinction. Yeah, the end goal is about changing behavior, but it's about imposing costs first. I guarantee you there is no hypothetical sanction or economic penalty were it to cross Vladimir Putin's desk, he were to read it and be like, well, shoot, we had a good go at it, but let's bring the boys home. But what it's about is turning up that pressure cooker of political pressure around Vladimir Putin and his seat of power. Especially when his rich friends, the oligarchs and the Siloviki, who are also rich, mind you, realized they could have lived off the interest in their, Swiss villa for the rest of their lives, but now they're international pariahs. But sanctions, I'll remind you, they take a long time to see their effect. So while my initial prescription is that they are effective, we've seen some pretty massive impact on the Russian economy, they just take a long time to be fully effective. So I would not judge their effectiveness completely for the next 6 months. As for the weapons aid and defense aid, I'll cut a few things out of what I was going to say because Marla said it so much better. I get asked a lot, like, is this going to escalate? Is this going to be seen as an act of aggression by Russia? Well, I would remind everyone that Russia is the escalatory position here. They are the one who have escalated the situation. And so for us to simply respond and allow Ukrainians to defend themselves in their homelands is, in my opinion, not at all escalatory. It is just being a good partner, as we promised them to be. After I wrote sanctions, I was in the Pentagon and did work on weapons aid to Ukraine in 2015, and that was the same thing. I guarantee you that there is no amount of weapons support that we can give President Zelensky and the Ukrainian army that will allow him to go on this Napoleonic march on Moscow. A few extra anti-tank missiles and Turkish drones are not going to threaten Russian sovereignty the way that Russian diplomats claim they will. So as for President Putin, I've spent over a decade trying to understand this man's political calculus, and the actions of the last 3 weeks have me utterly befuddled. I don't know what is going on with him. I think this war is very out of character for him and Russian political power. Now, I understand good students of history would say the war in Chechnya in 2000 looked a lot like this, but what I've seen from Putin is that he learned his lesson from Chechnya and the dangers and traps of urban conflict. And in previous conflicts, he's operated much more slowly, much more asymmetrically, has moved to be ambiguous and work against enemies from the inside. But Putin has this life ambition about a dysfunctional NATO and bringing Ukraine back home into the previous Russian Empire, which I will mind you, Connie reminded us that Ukraine is not at home with Russia. It is its own nation state. But just like a quote from a really fantastic movie, Kung Fu Panda, you meet your destiny on the path to avoid it. And Putin has done exactly that in Ukraine. I think launched this conflict to ensure that Ukraine would not join NATO, that it would not join the European Union, and that those two institutions would remain dysfunctional and tripping over their response. But that is exactly not what has happened. So Putin has learned that lesson harshly, and he's paid for it with thousands of lives in Ukrainian territory. I mean, the West is united behind economic and defense aid. I mean, God forbid, Switzerland and Sweden are off the bench of neutrality here. I mean, that's something we have never seen. Russian pipelines are shut down that deliver energy to Germany. The corporate world is in the middle of a mass exodus from the Russian economy, something I never would have predicted. Public opinion on NATO membership in Finland, of all places, is now majority positive. That is exactly what Putin did not want to happen. And just today, President Zelensky said that Ukraine would not aspire to join NATO. That might be breaking news for a few people here. It happened just a few hours ago. But honestly, I think that's because Ukraine has proven that they don't need NATO support to defend their homeland, other than weapons and economic aid. There's a common joke going around the ground in Ukraine that now NATO is an aspiring member of Ukraine. So, but basically, I don't think Ukraine needs NATO's political dithering. And now for Putin, we've fear-mongered in the West a lot about his grand autocratic coalition that he's built. This anti-democratic, hyper-efficient political mode of operating that includes China, Hungary, Europe's political right that could potentially win elections, the US political right as well. But now, his coalition, if you look at the votes in favor of their action in the UN, is reduced to Syria, Belarus, and Eritrea. So that's hardly the 3D chess playing geopolitical behemoth that we made Putin out to be. So is Putin still dangerous? Absolutely. And as Ukraine doesn't go the way he planned, I think he gets more dangerous. And as Marla said, there's a long road ahead of us that we just can't really predict. And so, can Ukraine be victorious? I think so. Also, that word sits sour in my mouth. I think it's a Pyrrhic victory no matter what has happened, given the thousands of lives we've lost so far. But I will say Putin, I think, is here to stay. And I might eat those words in a few weeks, and I hope I do, honestly. But I wouldn't be shocked if this turns out to be, his political undoing, as the full domestic effect of this conflict plays itself out in Russia. So I'll go ahead and leave it there. Super excited to hear everyone's questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chase. We do have a lot of questions. I'm going to try to clump them in similar themes. And so something that I think for sure Marla and Chase touched on was how long might we be in this space, whether it is a humanitarian crisis or Russia's continued presence in Ukraine. And so I want to turn to Marla and Chase, but before doing so, Connie, I want to go back to history. You spoke about the Mongols and the Tsars and other times that people have been in Ukraine. How long have some of those, I don't know if we can call them invasions or how they would be characterized, but how long have they lasted? Has it been years or decades? What does it look like for the Ukrainian people?
Well, Ukraine as a state, as a nation, never did cease to exist. The Tsars kept Ukraine pretty much its borders right now, but they imposed, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Pale of Settlement, but during the pogroms in Russia, all Jews were forced to move out of Russia into what is now Belarus, Ukraine, Vilnius, Lithuania, all the way down. And by doing that, they crowded and they made only Kiev was a city where Jews couldn't live, because Kiev was rather like the Paris of that world, because Kiev was so much more culturally and educationally advanced than Russia until, St. Petersburg really got going. It was a center. And so they never destroyed Ukraine, okay? They never dismantled it. They would take parts like Germany took parts, Lviv. Lviv has 4 different names, depending on who occupied it, because of what it was as a city. So I don't see them ever dismantling. It's just that they used it. And again, it was that grab for land because of the importance of Ukraine, because of its land, its minerals, its gold, etc., and a route to the sea. Russia has no route to the Southern Sea. So, Odessa's it for a deep seaport.
Honey, thank you. Marla, Chase, both of you spoke about how long this might last. And there's sort of the question of what might this look like within the country, within the region. But I think we've had some questions come in. How long will there be support from Americans, from Europeans, if we're faced with high prices at the pump, if countries are really overwhelmed with refugees, international organizations' capacity? What does that look like?
Chase, do you want me to go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. We should be prepared to do this for a long time, for years minimum. I mean, maybe decades. If you look at the type of damage that's happening in the country right now, it's catastrophic. So like your rebuilding of bridges and infrastructure and all those hospitals, I mean, it is a long-term project, and that's assuming that it stops now, right? So the longer it goes on, the more there's going to be. I believe that Western governments and populations need to be prepared to support this, because one of the things that you don't want to do is pay attention to a crisis as it's happening and then forget that you have to do all the things to, NATO calls it, create a safe and secure environment again for the civilians to live in, right? So that's the post-conflict piece of what we're talking about, even though we're in the hot conflict right now. So I say years, and I think, and I hope that Americans and Western citizens can really get on board with supporting this. I know it's really hard to, have this level of inflation and the pumps and all of these things, but there are people over there who are living much harder lives than you are. So I just want us to all remember that.
Yeah, I wish I had a magic wand and could embargo the talk about gas prices until people are no longer dying in Ukraine. And it was kind of unfortunate to hear that from Senator Risch in his opening remarks. I would respectfully ask him to focus on the human costs of this conflict. But yeah, our audience, if you're curious about how long this might last, I would have you Google Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Transnistria, because Russia is very good at creating what we call a frozen conflict. It's a very oxymoronic term because no front conflict is ever frozen. People die on the front lines every day of these things. But you know, the first time I stared down the barrel of a Russian rifle was in Abkhazia when I was, you know, living as a private citizen in Georgia. So for over 20 years, Russia has occupied internationally recognized sovereign territory of Georgia and Moldova. And they have the ability to potentially do this in Ukraine as well. And as they have for the last 8 years in Donetsk and Luhansk. And not to mention annexed Crimea. So they could very well dig in and take the gains they've accomplished so far and create a new line of contact that Ukraine has to deal with for the next 10 years before this blows up again. Also, as Marla said, the infrastructure of Ukraine is completely decimated, part in a defensive maneuver to stop the Russian advance, but also because of a result of Russian war crimes. And I don't think there is any room to both sides this conversation the way we love to do in American media. Russia is committing war crimes against Ukrainian citizens. So yes, I think we should dig in and prepare to stomach this news for a long time. And I hate to be so gloom and pessimistic, but that's just the reality of things.
No, you know, one thing I'd like to interject, because I'm older than all of you, but was just smashed. I mean, you can't even imagine. Russia used German prisoners of war to rebuild Kiev brick by brick. Just like, in a sense, we didn't use prisoners of war, but the Marshall Plan after World War II. We're going to need something like that to reestablish all these cities again, all the works of art, all the, it's very disappointing. I agree with Marlon Chase. It will take years and years unless we have something specific as a united world, maybe, to get in there and reestablish.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to a series of questions that touch on something Senator Risch stated in his remarks. Chase, it's also something that you shared in your opening as well, which is this question of, did we all see this coming? What was the intelligence? What were some of the conversations happening? The diplomatic community, the defense community, maybe the humanitarian community. And this point, Chase, that you mentioned about should we have started these sanctions 8 years ago? Why didn't that happen with the previous presidential administrations? And you know, so I'm really interested, Chase, Marla, and Connie, did we all see this coming?
Yeah, do you folks mind if I start on this? So, yeah, Senator Risch said something that, you know, he was an advocate for preemptive sanctions, I believe. And here we had this because we didn't impose a cost on Putin beforehand. I want to categorically disagree with that because, you know, like I said in my remarks, there is no economic penalty that can come across Putin's desk where he was like, aha, you got me there. All right, so I'll reverse course. First of all, the US economy is very, very isolated from the Russian economy. There is very little interaction that goes on between the two. You know, he talks about the Keystone XL pipeline in terms of energy imports, but we only import about 1% of our energy from Russia. And so we could leave the energy sector entirely untouched and still, you know, not necessarily impose a big economic cost. But what we have been able to do is find those allies that are very connected to the Russian and Ukrainian economy and focus on them. Germany is a really great example here, especially with their energy imports, who relies so much more heavily on Russia. But you don't preempt sanctions to avoid a conflict. You let diplomacy do that. Sanctions are an economically combative mechanism. And so you don't try and de-escalate the like standoff in the middle of the Western town by shooting first, right? And so you let that be a reactionary, punitive diplomatic mechanism. And so it was really important that we dangled these things in front of Putin and saying, we can erase X number of billions of dollars from your oligarchs and your economy if you go into Ukraine. And that is offering the off-ramp that we're looking for right now. And this man chose not to take it and to launch his war of choice. So yeah, I would disagree that we could do anything to prevent this because we are not Vladimir Putin mind readers. And I'll leave it there.
One of the things that I saw, all the gas for Europe, or nearly all of the gas for Europe, ran through Ukraine, and Russia paid Ukraine a fee for transport, a transport fee. Once the Nord Stream started going in, Putin saw that chance, all right, to isolate Ukraine by sending energy, natural gas, to Europe without going through Ukraine. As a matter of fact, at one point, they stopped paying Ukraine. They cut off the gas. And I know the schools that my Ukrainian host taught in went without heat for 2 weeks. All the schools did, because Russia cut off the gas coming through Ukraine, because they were going to raise the prices so high, because they knew they could go around Ukraine to go to Nord Stream. So I think that's partly Europe's problem also, that they have not looked at other sources of energy besides Russia.
And I would add, so yes and no. So 100% the military analysts that I talk to are like, this is not a good sign. We've got troops amassing, we've got movements going on the border, whatever it may be. I remember a discussion that I had, I think maybe like in late January or early February with one of my colleagues, and he's a former military person, and he said to me, he's like, this is gonna go down. And I was like, please stop. Just, I don't, like, it was almost in my brain, I was having like this internal dialogue with myself where I just did, like, if we didn't say it out loud, it wasn't gonna happen. But I do have to tell you that I was shocked at the scale and just the utter aggressiveness in which he chose to do it. I thought for sure it was going to look a little bit more like, let's take a few more, let's start taking a little bit more in the east. I did not think it was going to be multiple fronts. I did not have Belarus on my bingo card to be complicit or supportive in this whole thing. And it just, I think the aggressiveness in which he did it was a little shocking to me. But again, we're dealing with a person who is, difficult to understand, aggressive. I do not think he is irrational, but I do think that he's just a different type of thinker and actor than what we're used to seeing. And so Americans easily explain that away as being like, oh, he's an irrational actor. But actually, I don't think that's, I think there's more to it than that.
Yeah, Marla, real quick, I think that's perfect analysis, because I also expected just kind of an inflammation of this, frozen conflict, maybe move the line forward a little bit. I have been in Georgia where Putin has amassed, 100,000 troops on the border, run exercises, and then gone home after getting some energy import concession on a tariff or whatever. So yeah, this, again, I'll echo what I said before. I'm befuddled. I have no idea why he chose this calculus.
So there's a follow-up question, which is, why now? Is there a specific event? Was there a specific conversation? We've talked about this frozen conflict and sort of this kind of inching along, if you will, or things not changing over a period of time. But was there something in particular that really contributed to this?
We had Olympic Games. So no, I mean, it's a joke. Putin invaded Georgia after the 2008 Olympic Games and Ukraine after the 2014 Games in Sochi. It's weird. I don't understand why they always coincide with Olympic Games. But yeah, I think history will tell us there's going to be some revelation that crossed Putin's desk that had him act so grandiosely and so aggressively. And I don't know what that is yet. I don't want to get into these conspiracy theories like, oh, I saw his arm shaking, or like maybe there's a threat of a coup or something like that. That's just like such a intellectual trap that we get ourselves into all the time. When Marla said very well that he is a very rational thinker. He is a very intelligent man, and there's something we don't know yet.
Yeah, I would just add that he's almost constantly low-key trolling someone, right? Like, even if you look at our elections and you look at what happened with misinformation in our own elections, he's doing the same thing in his own country. He's trying to do it in Ukraine. He's doing it this is a very effective tactic to get people to focus over here while you're doing something over here. And so I just think, again, it's not irrationality. It's just a different way of thinking. It's a different strategy. It's different than what we're used to seeing in terms of the way that we expect global leaders to behave. And so it's disorienting, but I think that's the strategy, for it to be disorienting for us and to not make sense so that we're caught on our heels.
Yeah, I will follow up real quick in this sense of like what's going on right now is a distraction. There could be something we don't know about, but I don't think it's necessarily bigger than what is going on the ground in Ukraine now, because the Russian military simply doesn't have the capacity to act on a second front right now, unless they were to employ bigger weapons, which is just scares the crap out of me, and I don't even want to talk about. But I think what we've seen so far, I've seen some good military experts on the TV say, like, Russia is still good at logistics. They're still good at X, Y, and Z. And that I just have a hard time agreeing with that, because I think we've seen the consequences of a very strongly autocratic system and bureaucracy here, where, you don't want to deal with the consequences of telling your boss bad news. And this is something I learned teaching in this part of the world, is like, you only report good news up the chain. And maybe Connie, as a fellow returned Peace Corps volunteer, you might agree, like, I thought of my school director, and when I was like trying to write a grant, and she was just like, cool, just let me know when the money comes in, and also don't tell me anything terribly, about it. Just, you're great, go do it. And
Very true.
it can be true for the Russian military. It's like, you don't tell your lieutenant bad news, and your lieutenant doesn't tell your major bad news, who doesn't tell his colonel or his general. And so these systemic issues about lack of fuel, lack of ammunition, lack of plan, were not reported up the command chain. And so Putin thinks he's got this like troop of like rip-roaring, ready to go guys, ready to collapse Ukraine in 12 hours. And they were just not ready at all. And I think it's a consequence of that hierarchical structure.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. Ukrainians think that way too. If you watch some of the clips from Radio Free Europe of the troops, one of the soldiers, he says, they're effing stupid. They're firing those mortars everywhere, so we can locate them easy. Yeah, I think they don't have it. And nobody's reporting it. Yeah, nobody's moving it up.
So let's turn to China for a moment. China has emerged in the news, what are the conversations that are happening between leaders of Russia, leaders of China? What is the historic relationship between China and Ukraine? China and the region, does that play a factor here into what might be going on with China? Connie, Chase, Marla, I'm not sure who wants to begin.
I am not a China expert, so I have nothing on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Again, not a China expert. I went there once to talk about relations with Russia, with government officials. My only thought is I am a pedestrian observer of the issue in Taiwan, and I wonder whether or not China was hedging their bets on the Taiwan issue to see what international response might be. Were they to launch an operation to retake Taiwan? And I would venture they've been scared off of that now. So if you think sanctions, I mean, Russia's incredibly vulnerable to sanctions because it is this, in my opinion, one-trick pony economy that is fully dependent on energy exports. And so they can be especially devastating. Given the economic connection between China and the West, sanctions would be even more devastating to the Chinese economy and something that they have tried to build up for a long time. And so I talked in my remarks about this grand autocratic coalition that we presumed Putin had built. And I was a believer in it up until like 3 weeks ago. But I also said he would never take Crimea. So that shows you how good my crystal ball is. Yeah, I think if China wants to act on the Taiwan issue, they're going to have to redraw those plans.
You know, one thing I'd like to just comment on is Crimea. I think people need to understand Crimea's never been part of Russia. Look at it. It's a peninsula hooked to Ukraine. Russia was never even interested in Crimea, hardly. I'm trying to think which retired czar went to Crimea to hide in the mountains. And it wasn't until Nicholas that Lavinia Palace was built in Yalta. In other words, the Russians got interested because of the hot springs and the beauty. And then, of course, Stalin, claimed it. But it's never been, quote, part of Russia. It's not physically attached to Russia. So I don't know. That's a little pet geography lesson.
Thank you, Connie. Well, Marla, we have a question specifically for you. In your remarks, you talked about pre-positioning aid. And some people are wondering what that is. And I'd like to define it before we go to kind of the next bundle of questions.
Yeah, sure. So as you probably know, like when you have a country that's in a conflict or a crisis, there are countries that border it that have access through, land or easy crossings on water. What you want to try and do is have all the aid, and I guarantee this is already happening. I'm not a UN OCHA, humanitarian coordinator, but I guarantee these countries like Poland are already pre-positioning aid, and pre-positioning aid means having massive stashes of food, water, things that you would need, medical supplies, all the things that you need so that either as people are flowing over the border, they're able to access it immediately, or when there is a time where humanitarians can negotiate safe passage in, they can be easily pulling it in with them. So, humanitarians can often negotiate the ability to get in, and that's not something that governments are involved in, right? But the governments can be the ones providing the supplies that the humanitarians are accessing it and bringing in. So that's what I mean by making sure it's there ahead of the time that you need it, so that the logistical chain doesn't bog you down when it's needed today, right? And in many of those places that we were talking about, it is needed today, if not 3 weeks ago.
Thank you, Marla. So the next bundle of questions really has to do with how aid, whether it's on the humanitarian side or the military side, what's happening? Who is involved in these conversations? Is it bilateral, where it's one government with the government of Ukraine? Some questions specifically about the United Nations. People feel like they haven't heard much about the United Nations lately. There's been more about NATO in the news. Are there parts of United Nations that are really, working on the pre-positioning of aid. So I'm not sure who wants to take this one first. There were a lot of parts to it.
I'll talk about defense aid, Catherine, if that's okay.
Sure.
Since I worked on that issue in the NATO policy office in the Pentagon. Basically, when it comes to giving defense aid, it's always a tricky issue no matter what, because you're giving, lethal weaponry to another nation, one that you it might be aligned with, but you never know who might be elected there, what they might do with it. So it's very, very tricky. Basically, what we do is we invite a defense attaché in from an embassy to the Pentagon, and basically, give these folks a catalog, more or less. It's like, here's what we're willing to do, here's what we've got, and what do you want? And so I remember the Ukrainian defense attaché was very jumping up and down, screaming about Javelin missiles. We've seen, I never thought a Javelin missile would be all over the front page of the news, but here it is. It's an incredibly effective anti-tank system. But also, one thing you have to consider about defense aid is what we call absorption capacity. It is whether or not you have professionals in the military that you're looking at giving aid to who can take this equipment. So we can't just drop a F-35 on Ukraine, because Ukraine does not have pilots who can fly an F-35, for example. We can't just give them the Iron Dome anti-air system because they have not trained on it. We only have one ally, to my knowledge, who has, that's Israel, and we give them, basically whatever they want in the Iron Dome system. What we do have in the NATO alliance is a lot of old Soviet hardware, which Ukrainian operators are very well trained on. And so it's been really frustrating to see this dithering between the US and Poland on their MiG-29s. Poland has wanted to upgrade its Air Force for a long time. And here is perfect opportunity to offload their MiG-29s into the hands of Ukrainian pilots and then get trained up on F-16s or F-15s from the US. And I really wish if I could have one phone call with someone in the State Department now, I would say to expedite that deal as quick as possible. So yeah, defense aid is not as easy as it sounds. We can't just take our stockpiles and offload it into a friendly military like this. We need to make sure that it is what they need, they're trained on it, and that it'll be actually useful for the goals that we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree. I'll add one thing on weapons, and then I'll move to the humanitarian piece. So many of us who watch protection of civilians issues are concerned about what happens to all these weapons after a conflict. So when you are flooding a country with weapons, especially small arms are a big concern. You leave that country open to lots of various unseeming actors who are going to be looking to do, weapons trafficking or whatever it may be. It's incredibly dangerous for the civilian population, not to mention all the UXO unexploded ordnance that is going to be left behind by the two warring parties themselves. So there's that to consider from a civilian standpoint. Okay, so on the humanitarian thing, and this is not my area of expertise, but the UN will always be involved, right? So they have the Office of the Coordinator for Humanitarian Affairs, which is OCHA, and it's the organization that often takes the lead in a crisis like this. So they would also have UNHCR, which is the refugee organization. They would also probably have the World Food Program. They would probably have OHCHR, which is the human rights group. So there would be a whole, often what they call them, and I haven't studied this on what they've set up in Ukraine yet. So this is just me giving you sort of an overview of what it often looks like. There's a humanitarian, cell basically that's set up where ideally, there's coordination going on between the host nation and then also all of the various different NGO and UN actors and anyone else on the ground who's providing humanitarian aid.
Connie, is there anything that you wanted to add to what Marla and Chase highlighted with humanitarian and defense aid?
No, not particularly. Right now, I think you all know, and maybe the audience doesn't know, that there are certain groups like Chef Andre's Kitchen, which is doing a tremendous job. Save the Children is doing really great work. And also, of course, always the International Red Cross. And the International Crescent Society, which is the Arabic branch of the Red Cross. They're also doing a lot of work.
And also the National Red Cross organizations are raising a lot of funds and helping to send, yeah. So like even the Americans, the Canadians, like they're sending all sorts of supplies and things as well.
So it sounds like it's a combination of NGOs, international organizations, bilateral conversations that are taking place, maybe some multilateral conversations as well.
Doctors Without Borders is another big contributor right now.
Well, we're going to shift a little bit. There is another bundle of questions that are coming in about the conflict itself, the war. We've heard in the news war crimes. We've also heard about perhaps chemical, biological weapons. So I'm just going to package all these questions together. We're eager to hear your responses. What are the rules of war? Can you kind of give a high level overview as to what that looks like? There's also questions related to what's happened in Syria, and do you think that that will happen in Ukraine? What does the end game look like? Is it really to take parts of Ukraine and have them be part of Russia? Is it for Putin to form a new Soviet Union of sorts? And then why is Putin recruiting soldiers from Syria and Chechnya?
Do you want me to take that? I'll take the international law question. So I'm sure we've all been hearing in the media that there are, there's a couple of things I think that we can look at here. Anytime you have a conflict, in peacetime, we have international law, you have national laws, and then you have international human rights laws that govern kind of what governments can do to their own people. When you have a conflict, you then add an additional sort of, I won't call it layer because they don't really layer on top of each other, but an additional body of law, which is international humanitarian law. And that's the branch of international law that basically seeks to impose limits on the destruction of suffering caused by the armed conflict. So under that body of law, you have there's 4 principles. You have the principle of humanity. So you're trying in all things that you're supposed to try, I should say, in all things that you do to preserve humanity. You then have the principle of distinction. So you have to make a distinction between civilians and civilian infrastructure and objects and combatants. And then you have the principle of proportionality, which basically means whenever you're calculating an attack, you have to take into consideration whether or not that attack is proportional, if the military gain that you expect to get out of it is actually proportional to what civilian harm might happen. Because again, under international humanitarian law, it is not illegal to harm civilians, but it has to be taken into this calculus of these 4 pillars. And then the final is military necessity, that the attack is something that has to be done for military necessity. You can't just attack things for the fun of attacking them or to cause sort of superfluous injury. And so I think in Ukraine, we're certainly seeing war crimes under IHL. I think there's also discussion of whether or not this was a crime of aggression. And I think many people are obviously do believe that that's the case. The ICC has already opened an investigation. The ICC is the International Criminal Court, which kind of looks at all of these issues across the world. Yeah, I think that's it. Oh, and then also you have human rights violations. So if you have things that are going on that are below the threshold of conflict. So for example, if the Ukrainian government were to start doing things that were depriving people of their ability to leave the country or depriving people of their ability to live their lives in a way where they enjoy their human rights, then that also is a body of law that applies.
one of the things that or more than one, why Russia needs Ukraine, Odessa. Odessa is a deep sea port. It is the only deep sea port on the southern coast of the Black Sea. Mariupol is a port, but it's not a deep sea port. So they need that whole area. Of course, they have their submarine base. They had that anyway in Yalta, Sevastopol. And that agreement was still in effect whenever they took over Crimea. So, and the rail lines, I saw somebody ask a question. Ukraine has a complex rail system, very efficient, and it is connected to Russia. And that's the way across land. This is, not with trucks, but the rail lines are really important. And Ukraine has the same type of gauge rail lines that Russia does, but they do not have the same rail lines gauge, as Europe does. Because if you go into Ukraine by rail, the wheels, the undercarriage, have to be closed. Have you ever experienced that, Marla? You have hours at the border changing. Yeah. So it's really important for a lot of reasons, besides the minerals, besides the wheat, the corn, the agriculture. It's very important to Russia.
I'll jump on the tail end here and add a little bit about, I believe the question focused on the end game. Let me talk a bit about the Russian calculus here, especially the domestic one. And I've reminded all of my classes and previous lectures I've given that we look on the map and we see Russia, but let's not attribute this to Russians per se. This is a profoundly unpopular war among Russians. And, I've spoken to a lot of my friends there, 100% of them are against this action. But there's one profound thing, and Putin's psyche was shaken profoundly in 2012 during the Bolotnaya protests, where I have a ribbon in the desk behind me, and it says "Za Rossiyu bez Putina." It's like for Russia without Putin, and 100,000 people in Moscow alone and in major cities all across the country took part in these protests. It was a near color revolution, just like the Orange Revolution or the Rose Revolution in Ukraine and Georgia, respectively. Putin and, Russia and Ukraine are so inherently linked, the way that Connie has very expertly described to us tonight. And so Ukraine, so goes Ukraine, so goes Russia, in my opinion. And for it, I know this is a long setup, but just bear with me. Putin, I think, has done what he has done in Ukraine in the last 10 years, not necessarily as a foreign policy concern, as a big geopolitical concern, but about his own domestic politics. And that is because if Russian people say, hey, we want to westernize, we want to democratize, we want to open ourselves up to free ideas and free economic exchange, he points to the brother nation, Ukraine, and says, look what happens when they did the same thing, when they flirted with the same thing. It's chaos there. It's war there. And I completely control the information space, so I can tell you how that war started. It's drug addicts and Nazis and these conspiracy theories. So I think that the one thing that has been really missing from the analysis so far is the domestic Russian political concern in this thing. And so as the conflict might be drawn out, it might happen for a long time and be especially destructive, like Marla explained to us, Putin can, if he holds on to power, can explain to Russian political concerns, not young people, not activists or anything like that, because he's probably lost those folks forever, but there's still the vast majority of people who are willing to listen to him and watch state media. And so for him to hold on to power, I think it's important that Ukraine remain non-democratic. So.
Chase, thanks for that segue. We have had some questions come in about do we know a lot about the information that Russians have? What they know is going on. I think just yesterday, there was the video footage of the journalist who walked onto the state media set. So can you speak to what Russians know, and do they have, back to some of the remarks Connie had in her opening, do they have affection for the Ukrainian people? What does that look like?
Yeah, great. I love that segue because, again, millions and millions of Ukrainians or Russians have ties to Ukraine, studied there perhaps in the Soviet Union, or have family members who are Ukrainian. This is incredibly connected countries here. But to be in the Russian information space, it's like entering an alternative universe. It's like if you're a Russian speaker and you watch Первый канал, it's nuts. We had this job in the U.S. Embassy in Russia where one person per night was supposed to watch the primetime news broadcast. We had a counter and we had to click each time they said Americans are fascists. And I think the record, this was around the time Ukraine was invaded last, was 67 times in a 30-minute news broadcast. And so, yeah, it's a completely different information space. But not all Russians get that information space because they have not walled off the internet from the rest of the world the way that China has. We heard about the Great Firewall of China. Young people speak English there. Generally, they are on Snapchat, Facebook, and TikTok and Instagram, and they read BBC News and things like that. So, yeah, Russians know, a subset of Russians know what is going on in Ukraine. And dare I date myself as a millennial, I think there's this like okay boomer aspect of the information space in Russia where you see wide, broad-based support among people over the age of 50 for the war. And it's because they're operating in a different information space. The only thing they do watch is Первый канал. They don't have Instagram. They don't have, they're not on Twitter. But young people are. And we see there's one really solid independent think tank in Moscow left called the Levada Center. And they do public opinion polling to the Western standard. They do it openly. They're really, really good at it. And they've shown that about 70 to 80% of people under the age of 40 in Russia want to or are actively trying to leave the country. And so as long as this goes on, I say Putin, not Russia, Putin's political power and structure will see the bottom fall out from under it. Unfortunately, I tell students and people I work with, Putin does really concern me, but what comes after Putin concerns me even more, because there are more radical elements within Russian political leadership that can really take this thing to another level. But don't worry, everyone, because there are more reasonable elements that have good relations with Western interlocutors. And so let's just hope we come down on a good side of the coin flip when and if the post-Putin era comes.
I'll just add on a little bit to that. So for those who look at and study conflict, you may have heard, people talk all the time about hybrid conflict or gray zone conflict. I would argue that Russia's been engaged in near peer conflict with us for years now. Some of the things that feature heavily in hybrid conflict are things like misinformation. I mean, look at the last 6 years of the United States and how the information landscape has changed and how influential Putin and Russia have been on the US landscape, right? And then think about cyber. So there were cyber attacks that, allegedly Russia was behind in the United States. They're doing the same thing in Ukraine. They're doing the misinformation thing in Ukraine. It is one of their most relied on tactics, and they are very good at it. And so, when we're in a hot war now, but we've been in this buildup in the gray zone, so to speak, for quite a long time, in my opinion.
Right.
Connie, anything to add?
Yeah, for Chase and Marla. I mean, I totally agree. One of the latest polls before the Russians actually invaded, but when they were threatening, that was done in Ukraine, shows that the support for the Ukrainian government, for Zelensky, even in the East, in the Donbass and Luhansk area, is nearly 80%. I don't know if people realize, but there are very few people involved in that whole government thing, separatist movement, but because of the support from Russia, they've been able to, in a way, control what happens. And like Marla said, the propaganda that goes to Eastern Ukraine, especially the Donbass and Luhansk area, is just unbelievable. Yeah.
Well, we somehow have moved very, very quickly through our time together. And I want to ask the same question of each panelist and make sure you have time for your answer. So it's sort of a two-part question. One is, how can we learn more about Ukraine, more about this part of the world? What resources do you recommend? And the second one is, what can people do if they want to help?
I can go first. So I dropped a whole bunch of links in the chat, and I'm sorry that's a little bit overwhelming, but they're all sort of a little bit different. So the project that I focus on in NATO and protection of civilians is in there. That's a little bit of a different thing, but it's really important when we're thinking about protecting Europe. And especially as Ukraine is a partner nation of NATO, and then some other things specifically about Ukraine. Several reports there specifically about Ukraine and international law and all the various different things. I just ask that everyone stay engaged, because I know it's compassion fatigue is a thing. Like, it's an actual psychological phenomenon, and it happens. It happened to Afghans. It happened to Iraqis. We have to stay engaged with this country, and we have to continue to watch what's going on, because as soon as Americans don't care anymore, our government's not going to care. So keep pressure on and keep your attention focused. And I think that's, I have some resources that I can send through to you through the email, but I don't have them up right now. So if you want to donate or do things like that, I can send that to you later and you can pass that around.
I would say on learning about Ukraine, Anne Applebaum, nearly anything she writes about, and you can always email me for a bibliography, and Svetlana Alexievich, her books are about the Soviet Union, but that of course includes Ukraine. If you'd like more about the revolutions, on Netflix, Winter of Fire is a award documentary on the 2014 Revolution of Dignity. And there's an excellent film on the Orange Revolution. You would probably have to buy it like I did, but I would be glad to send anybody reliable resources for reading and research.
Yeah, so I am the teacher here. I'll give a syllabus no matter what. And I can always email this to Catherine to get it out. Got about 12 books I would recommend. I'm not going to list them all off right away. Got two up right behind me here. Putin's Kleptocracy by Karen Dawisha is a really good one. And then Ben Judah, Fragile Empire is a really great book to understand Vladimir Putin. Also, I would highly recommend the BBC documentary, Putin, Russia, and the West. It's a 4-part documentary on, there's an episode on the Orange Revolution, the Rose Revolution in Georgia and the war, as well as the famous reset with the US, which fortunately we couldn't get to tonight. I have a lot of strong feelings about the reset. Other great books, Anna Reid's Borderlands, History of Ukraine, is a really great I was assigned that in grad school, but it is written and is very accessible for a broad-based audience. But again, I'll echo everyone else here. Please keep good information discipline. It's really easy to fall into the trap of seeing something on Twitter of another Ukrainian farmer stealing a tank. It's hilarious. I get a kick out of it too, but also make sure you're going through official sources before you consolidate your own opinion and reaction to this. And there are a lot of avenues for support. The Ukrainian military has set up crowdfunding resources, but if I could get up on my soapbox, I would ask everyone to kind of focus their support, attention, and resource donations to the human cost of the conflict first, instead of the kinetic aspect of it. Donate to the International Rescue Committee and the Red Cross and Save the Children before you kick a monetary donation to Ukraine and the military. If you want to support the Ukrainian military, the best way to do that is to call people like Senator Risch and ask for higher material support from the US military to Ukrainians on the ground. But time, talents, and treasures, focus on the Ukrainian people, please.
I really want to thank you, Chase, Connie, Marla, for speaking with City Club of Boise and with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute this evening. We really appreciate your expertise, your perspectives. You really complemented each other in this conversation. We're so grateful. Thank you.